Yeah, well, I'll just go with the comment to myself then, and we'll start off. So basically, I think maybe my colleague is used to debating perhaps some certain Christians and what have you. I like to think that perhaps we're a slightly different breed in terms of our approach or philosophical approach. I don't think he addressed actually what I said, and I think strawman my argument. For example, I'll give you an example. So I never said everything that begins to exist has a cause. I never used that because you could always say, well, how do you know everything does begin to exist? And that would require empirical verification, which is that's why I never said it in the first place. I merely posited that ultimately, and I don't know where this ultimately is. I just said ultimately there will be a cause. I don't know how old the universe is. Maybe we've been through a couple, 6 or 7 big bangs and big crunches until getting to this point. Of course, the universe is everything that exists. I merely said that at some point it has to start somewhere, because an infinite regress would mean there would be no change, no creation, nothing. And the same for things like what matter is composed of. I never made an assumption that it is quantum vacuum energy or superstrings, which a lot of scientists now doubt the idea of superstring theory, a bit fantastical. But I just posit those two, like, say whatever you want. The question can always be asked, what are they made out of? What are they made out of? If their attributes come from what they're made out of, for example, then what can they made out of? Until you get to the point where there must be something that's fundamental, a fundamental substratum that supports all reality's existence. And if it's fundamental and it's necessary, then it wouldn't be limited and it would be self-sufficient, because it wouldn't require anything prior to it or underneath it or further more fundamental than itself. So these are the arguments I made, but I guess just to reframe this discussion in terms of what I mean by atheism, or why I mentioned the term atheism. You're right, atheism isn't a belief, but I posited that it carries a necessary corollary, something attached to it, which is, if you don't believe in God's existence, not that you may be it's just your default. No, if you don't believe in God's existence, that means that your worldview does not require you to posit God to explain things. And I really posited that reality imposes certain problems if you want to keep God out of that discussion, because ultimately you can't explain cause, matter, specificity, or limited and finite things. And my explanation isn't one where I know stuff because I've observed it, is that God is the only explanation to avoid self-contradictions. And that's pretty much it. Like I'm saying, if we take 2 and we add 2, I know that this will equal 4, because taking the premises, the conclusion must follow. So likewise, I know that the premises are the existence of finite things. That's the premises. So I know that eventually at some point, it must follow that there must be a beginning point, a creating point, a start point, and a fundamental substratum that's supporting all things. Even though I don't know where the boundary of that is. That's my argument.
Could you put that into deductive form?
Into deductive form? Well,
so 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a deductive form. It's a premise and a conclusion. It's not deductive form to say there is matter and matter must have a beginning. What's the deductive argument there?
Well, for example, it's the avoidance of contradiction. So because I'll just explain. So if I was to say 2 plus 2 equals 6, right, and 6 meaning what we conventionally understand 6 to be, we'd know that was wrong because of contradiction. So my point was that if you were to say, well, before this point in time, there was an infinite number of moments or movements, I would say we would never reach this point in time because it would be a contradiction.
I know what he's trying to get at.
It's one of the longest questions I've ever been asked. I think you know what I'm saying.
You're trying to say, you want us to say everything that begins to exist has a cause.
No, that's not necessarily the kalam. That's not what I'm going for. All I'm saying is that the reason why you can say that 2 plus 2 equals 6 is false is because you're right, it leads to a logical contradiction. The reason for that is because it's essentially a logically valid argument with premises and conclusions, and you can identify exactly how it contradicts. You can put it into a truth table and show that it's false.
2 plus 2 equals 4?
Yes.
It's a tautology though. 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Well, precisely. It's a tautology, and you can prove that deductively. Mm-hmm. But there's no... Can you highlight precisely what the premises are and the conclusions are of your argument here, so
does
you can
it,
do it in
need
the
to be
same
outlined
way?
like that? Because
it does if you're going to say that it leads to contradictions if you don't agree with the conclusion.
Well, it does, because an
infinite
regress is basically saying that there was no beginning, and yet we're explaining, or there was no cause, and we're explaining the cause of things, or we're explaining the beginning of things, or we're explaining movement. So there was no first movement, but there is movement. So it creates a contradiction in terms, because in essence, we rely on a pre-existing state or pre-existing conditions of movement, and yet ultimately you're saying there is no beginning to this pre-existing thing. There's just an eternal chain, that there is no start to it, and therefore it's the same as saying nothing actually
I'm trying to get you
exists.
to prove that we require
Right, so
one.
I've got one statement that can kind of summarize it for you. Anything susceptible to additional subtraction cannot be infinite.
Okay.
Okay, so it doesn't need to be a deductive 3-stage deduction.
Well, no,
It can
that
be-
makes it a
Right, so no, I'm
that's
just giving
fine.
one statement. What he's saying is that if you have an infinite thing and you add to it, then there's the absurdity of adding to an infinite physical quantitative thing. So you'd have to disprove that statement. Now we've made the statement, anything susceptible to addition or subtraction cannot be infinite.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for you to prove your infinite regress, if you wanted to prove it, you have to prove, or you have to show how it's demonstrably possible for something to have infinity as a quality, as well as addition and subtraction there as well.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
So then you can't really make any claim.
I don't know, but I'm not making a claim. That's the thing.
So then why are we having this discussion?
Because I'm opposing your claims.
Well, you can't oppose
Your
it,
claim
isn't
is that your claim is that it requires it, and I'm just asking you why that's the
I'm
case.
saying anything that is
the logical form, the idea that it is logically necessary to have causation, or that there can't
No,
be
we didn't say anything about causation.
There can't be an infinite regress.
No, I've just said what I've said.
This
Can we just have a final statement from you and from you?
Yeah.
Can I
Just
have-
the
can I have
statement.
my two-
Sorry, apologise.
the
The statement I made
the
was that
idea-
anything susceptible to addition or subtraction cannot be quantitatively infinite.
Yes,
you have to.
according-
If
according
you're
to laws-
rejecting that, you have to disprove that. How is it physically, mathematically, or otherwise? How is it possible to have a quantifiable infinite which is susceptible to addition or subtraction? That's all you have to do.
It's another issue of burden of proof. It's not on me to prove that.
Well, I've just made the claim.
It's false. It's you to prove that's true, and you failed to do so.
Okay, I'll give you an example,
And
right?
if you'll allow me to answer the question,
ahead.
the
Can
answer
we just
is
leave it after this one? Yeah.
Yeah.
the answer is that you're right. Like, these things are required
Okay.
according to laws of logic and physics that are predicated on the existence of the universe. And we're talking about the universe.
Why is
coming
it
into
predicated on the
existence.
existence of the universe?
Because
Can you prove it?
well, no.
Okay, so why are you
But
making a claim? It's an active claim.
It's a possibility, right?
No, it's an active claim, which is.
And it's a
It's not possibility.
It's possibly
Do
true.
you know why it's not a
And if
possibility?
it's possibly true,
No, it's not possible true.
why is it not possible?
Because if the universe is a possible existence, then it cannot explain the existence of other possible existences.
If there is a necessary
Did you get that? Do you understand that? Pat?
yes, I'm asking you a question in return. If there is a
No,
necessary
but can you address that first?
If this is what I'm trying to do with
Yeah.
the question. If there is a necessary being or occurrence, and that entails another,
Which is what you admit.
and that entails
Yeah.
another occurrence,
No, it doesn't entail.
and if it does,
No, it doesn't work like
if
that.
I may just, so I think the confusion is, firstly, I don't think all things require putting into a logical syllogisms. I don't
Yes.
think it's necessary.
they do if you're going to say they're
I'm
a
saying that.
contradiction.
No. It does when you're making contrary propositions. You don't. Doesn't a sentence could say that this sentence is false. It creates a contradiction within the sentence without it being a logical syllogism.
Yeah, but again, that is logically
I'm
false.
merely pointing out that there are ultimately only two possibilities
Yes.
to basically anything that you might observe, which is finite, limited, and what have you, which is
Yeah.
either it was the result of something more fundamental than it, or something that is prior to it. And if you ask, well, what was prior to anything, or what is more fundamental to anything? Either it's something that's like itself, as in something finite, limited as well, or something not the case, not finite and not limited. So I'm saying that if we go down the pathway of just constantly insisting on there's a continual chain prior to this existence of finite, limited things, nothing would exist, because that would cause an infinite regress fallacy, and thereby the contradiction is manifest. As opposed to ultimately at some point saying, well, actually, you know what? At some point, I don't know where, but at some point there was a beginning, or there was something that was not finite, whereby it doesn't have limitations, and just to kind of justify to you, limitations requires explanation. Something that doesn't have limitations doesn't require explanation, because there's no limits for it to be, there's nothing to create its limits for it to be explained by something else.
No, it still
So,
requires explanation.
Let's leave
no,
this
because
one.
what would
Absolutely.
okay,
Okay.
Can
okay.
I getting tangled up? Colin,
Yeah.
do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to make the very old, simple observation that if you say God created it all, the next obvious question, of course, is who created God? And
Colin,
nobody has given a very satisfactory
just one-
answer. But please let me finish.
Oh,
Let
sorry.
me finish.
Sorry, apologies.
And the second one is, as I say, you are talking the language of certainty. What we have learned in the course of my lifetime is that the origins of the universe have been pushed further and further back in time. It's a fascinating study. I don't pretend to understand more than the average man in the street about it. But to say that we clearly understand the nature of creation seems to me extremely arrogant. And to pretend that you can speak with certainty about something like that, I think is, to put it mildly, not justified.
Well, I think it's a little arrogant to actually dismiss what we actually said, because we never actually claimed that we know every tiny particle in this universe, or how big it is, or where it began. We never actually said that. So, Edith, it shows that you weren't listening. I'm just saying that you did. I'm just saying that it shows that you weren't listening to what we were saying, and some people might say that's arrogant too. What I'm saying is very simply this: creation or causation or whatever you want to call it is to limit something, to define its limitation. Like when you draw a circle, you're drawing a limitation. So limitations require explanation. But if something has no limitation, then there's nothing that requires it to be determined, because it has there's no boundaries that exist in it. It is fundamentally unlimited.
Exactly.
That's why we say it doesn't require
You can't just
creation.
posit a necessary being and say it doesn't require any explanation.
No, we're not
because it's
positing
necessary.
I didn't say necessary, I said
But that's the opposite of
unlimited.
limited.
No, because limitations require explanation, right? Not lack thereof. Right?
And limitation as opposed to what? What's
As
the
opposed
opposition
to
there?
not being limited.
And what is
Having no
something that's not
themselves.
limited?
Well,
It's necessary, because if it's not necessary, then it's limited.
What's your definition of necessary? Because you keep using it incorrectly. What's your understanding of necessary existence?
Well, you were talking about contingent things. It's the opposite of that. So,
So
something
can you give a definition?
something that cannot have been differently. That cannot
Okay,
not
cannot
have
be
existed,
differently,
for
and there's no
instance,
explanation for it
yes. What,
outside of itself.
well, I suppose so.
Right,
yes,
right.
but
And
you'd
okay,
have
so can you tell us how there can be a world with no necessary existence?
well, who says you said we're living in a world of possible, or you said that we have to claim that we're living in a world of possible existence.
Do you agree that there could be
Nobody's claimed that.
Do you accept that there is a necessary existence?
I would say that yes.
Then that's God.
But that doesn't have to be God.
Debate over. Thank you
It
very
does
much.
not- no,
Because
that does not have to be God. I'm sorry,
No,
it does not
that's
have to be
that's
God.
our understanding of God.
It does not have to be God.
Yeah, for us, a necessary existence is something which is perfect. Couldn't be any other way. Explains everything else. That's our definition of
It
God.
explains everything else.
Because it's necessary, it couldn't be any other way. All
couldn't
contingent.
have been any other way.
All
That's got no
contingent
explanatory power.
Alex, all contingent things depend upon it. Yes.
Give me an example of a contingent thing.
This cup,
How was it contingent?
because it could have otherwise not been in existence.
Do you know you're speaking to a determinist?
Pardon?
Do you know you're speaking
Yeah.
to a
Okay. So where did determinism
So
come from?
if
You said in your thing. Sorry.
What determined it?
Yeah.
let me ask you a question. This
Go
might
ahead.
seem isolated, but it will make sense.
Go ahead.
If P entails Q,
Go
and
ahead.
P is necessary,
Yes.
is Q necessary?
No.
It's not.
No. No, it's not. It doesn't have to be. If necessary,
Right, so-
hold on. Let me explain why. What we're doing here is we've said that these dependent contingent things,
As you're defining them,
do you accept that this cup could have otherwise not been in existence?
no.
So okay,
That's what determinism is.
Well, hold on. So you believe in determinism?
Yes.
And you said in your speech, in your thing, a universe from nothing, you said that determinism comes from the necessary existence.
Are you talking about the contingency debate with
48
Justin
minutes,
Riley?
yes. 48 minutes in, you said that one necessarily leads from the other. In other words, determinism leads from necessary existence. Yes or no?
Sorry, say that again.
You said
Determinism leads-
determinism leads from necessary existence.
Okay, I think we were talking about a different thing when we were
No.
talking
You
about
said
necessary
this, and I can show you 48 minutes into the
Yes,
video.
I said that sentence, but I meant a
All right,
different
so
thing by
no,
necessary
hold on.
existence.
So you said the universe was necessary
This
existence.
can't be a semantic point scoring exercise. I
It's
meant
not.
something different by what you're
No
talking
problem.
about.
But you said this. You said
Definitions matter.
You said determinism comes from the necessary existence.
What did I mean by that? I mean,
You-
I
okay,
require
I'll tell
the
you what you
context
meant
of the
because I
conversation to
remember
know what I was actually
I
meaning by
just
those
listened to this
terms.
2 days ago. The guy asked you, "Is the universe? Would you agree with Bertrand Russell that the universe just is?" Yeah, and you replied and said, "Yeah, the fact that the universe is necessary existence, I would agree with that in the first instance." And then he said, "How would that tie in with determinism?" You then said, "Determinism follows from determinism follows from the necessary existence."
Right, I know what you're
do you
talking
remember?
about. I was the person I was debating with, a guy called Cameron Batuzzi, he
Yes.
was making the case for the contingency argument. And
Right.
he was saying that there are contingent things in the universe, and therefore he was using that to reason that there's a God. And I said that if that were the case,
Yes.
that necessary existence, the
Yes.
determinism would follow from that. I was making
Perfect.
the case.
Okay, so
I didn't
agree
say
with
that
you.
it does exist.
Listen, Alex,
I didn't say that it does exist.
We agree with you on that point. So this is the thing. You agree with us on more points than you think you agree with us on. You believe in a necessary existence. which explains everything else.
No, necessary existence. Be careful.
You said a necessary existence. Are you retracting it?
I said that
Are you retracting it?
the universe, there's not one unified necessary existence.
But you said that the universe was a necessary.
The
So are you
universe
retracting that?
The universe follows a necessary causal chain.
Okay, so is there? No, you said. Hold on. You said the universe is a necessary existence, and then you said determinism follows from that. Now I'm saying that.
Okay,
you
how about
accept,
this? If I said that and I meant what you think I meant by
Yes.
that, then yes, I retract it. But I
So
don't
you
think
retract
that,
it.
But I don't think that's
Do
what
you
I
know, I
meant.
think what it is, Alex, is that you.
But
keep,
people can go and look
no,
that for
Alex, I'll
themselves.
tell you
You're
what-
very good at making arguments against things I used to believe in.
Okay,
Let's
so
talk
you
about
used to
things
believe in
that
it
we'll
because okay, now it's perfect.
Guys, we're not on speaker's corner.
Okay.
No, 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 no.
Turn it down a bit, right? Argument, counter.
No, no, it's
Yes.
important, guys, because if you're changing your
Can I
argument
have
now,
Fine by
an
me.
answer? Can I have an answer
yeah,
to
you're
my
changing it
question
because
about
now you've
who
been cornered. That's
created
the only
God?
reason why you've changed your argument.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll do that.
I will respond to, so
Who
the,
created God? Colin Brew's argument.
yeah, well, we have to actually ask the question, why does anything need creation in the first place? Right? It's a more fundamental question, yeah? So, I mean, I could take this club, but sometimes I just take a stone or something and I say, how do you know that this actually thing was created or required creation? So if this thing was, let's say, eternal or let's say uncreated, then why is it in its particular shape, form, and so on and so forth that it didn't choose? If something was uncreated and nothing determined its limitations, then it wouldn't have limitations, which is my point. So therefore, it's kind of ridiculous to argue that God requires creation when he has no limits that require defined by anything to be defined by or determined by something else. And that's why we know that anything is created is only because it has limitations.
How long do you think God's been around for?
Eternity.
Well, okay. What I'll say is that God is outside of time, so there's no pre-existent time before him. Right, he's the beginning.
How do you know?
But you know what?
a necessary
I just want to kind of just
You're
pause
making
and
a
rewind
statement.
something that you mentioned in your presentation. I just want to just briefly touch on it before we touch anything else, which is you said that Islam is terrified of people professing atheism, right? Again, I think that I don't know what experience you've had maybe with from reading European history books, but I suppose you should read books from about Mesopotamia and Islamic
I quoted the
civilization.
experience
The
of
Prophet
a
Muhammad,
current
if I may just finish, I'll let you respond. So the Prophet Muhammad had a famous debate with a Bedouin atheist, right? There was no intolerance there. The Bedouin atheist actually became Muslim, but there was no intolerance just because the guy initially professed to be atheist. Abu Hanifa, famous classical scholar in medieval Iraq, Baghdad actually, had public open-air debates with atheists. Presumably there's atheists who were living in Baghdad at the time to actually be invited to open-air debates, and no one killed them or was intolerant to them at all whatsoever. And when you say, oh, Islam is terrified of atheists, I just want to say something. You're not special. We encounter polytheists, we encounter Christian Trinitarians, we encounter Zoroastrians throughout our history, and from our perspective, you're all arguing exactly the same thing, which is somehow the finite thing is also infinite and eternal, and we don't really see you as different. Actually, you're just another let's say just not a flavor of ice cream that we are basically encountering. So don't make yourself out to be more special than you are from our perspective. And as for the issue of tolerance of atheists, I think you should question your founders of your very ideology which pervades the West, liberalism. John Locke, in his Letter on Toleration, argued that you should tolerate different Christian sects, Protestants basically, but not atheists, because you can't trust what they say. They don't believe in any higher moral value other than merely what is expedient. Rousseau made also the same argument, and some people say that under the current, you could say, atheistic idea as opposed to the natural rights arguments of John Locke, but the Benthamite arguments of utilitarianism. Really, morality is only based on expediency, and then people's rights are based on whether it's expedient to the state to even tolerate your rights. So now this is not related to the debate itself, but the guy brought it up, and it's really disingenuous to bring up in that kind of debate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, are you suggesting that someone like Socrates was a deeply immoral man?
No, I'm not saying it. I'm saying John Locke.
You seem to be implying.
No. John Locke said that you can't trust atheists. He didn't say that they are necessarily by default.
The difference is that the things which our worldview are based upon, which are the philosophies of these men, we can say that those areas of their philosophies were wrong. John Locke said some pretty egregious things.
You're a nihilist. How can you say anything's
The
right or
difference
wrong?
is, we'll get to that. The difference is...
No, you can't say that you're wrong.
No,
I'm not going to grant you that.
I think I actually
I'm not
can.
going to grant you that. You don't believe in objective morality.
The difference is that you can't do the same thing.
No, you can't do it at all.
When there is something
You
immoral,
don't believe in objective
when there is
morality.
something immoral in the basis, when there is something immoral that comes from somebody who founded the worldview that we believe in, and something else unrelatedly that he said that no longer applies was wrong.
Can you prove it's immoral?
We can say that we disagree with
Can
what
you
he
prove
had to
it's
say.
immoral on your worldview?
We can say that we disagree with what he had to.
You're making an active claim. So
you
can
can't
you
do the same thing.
You're making an active
When
claim.
there's immoralities in the Quran,
Right.
you can't make the same. Look, we have just allowed you to speak, and there were many times I could have interjected and asked you similar questions, and you're making a two-quay fallacy, and you're smart enough to know it. You can't just turn around and say
Just-
that you're
just
a
answer the
hypocrite
question,
for
please.
being a moral nihilist, especially since I'm not one anymore.
Oh, you've changed your mind now.
Yes,
So you
quite
retract that
publicly
statement as
so.
well?
What statement?
The ones that you said you're a moral nihilist?
What do you think moral subjectivism meant to me and means to me? What do you think
I don't
it
know what it
means
means to you, man. That's a subjective
so
statement.
you're saying you can't say this because you're a moral subjectivist and a moral
Yeah,
nihilist.
you're making a moral claim,
What do you
you're
think
passing
that
moral
means?
judgment.
What is moral subjectivism?
Yeah, so you don't have objective morality. It's not fixed. It's not true or false. It's, despite human thoughts or convictions, that morality is true. So it's only first person subjective.
Let's get a succinct answer to that.
Yeah,
statement
my
on
question,
this
can I ask
side.
one question, then you can answer it?
Yeah, go.
My question is, he's made it very clear on his public profile that this man does not believe in objective morality. Why and how can you say this in one breath and then passing moral judgments which are based on liberalism? Can you explain how atheism accounts for that or how it does
As
it?
I say, that's a two-quay fallacy.
It's not a
It's
two-quay fallacy.
interject,
It
Let him answer.
is Latin
Go
for
ahead.
you as well. It's simply saying, well, you do this too, so who are you to speak? That's not what
No,
we're doing
no.
here. We are working on your worldview. Your worldview claims that morality is objective, and your worldview has objective moral statements, like the ones I've highlighted. It's your job to prove
Yeah.
that those can be coherent with any
God
kind of
said so.
objective morality.
God is all-knowing. God said so. That's what we believe. Anything God says is all-knowing.
Anything God says is moral.
Yes.
Okay,
Can
well,
you refute that, please?
I don't need to. All I need.
No,
all I
you
need to
can't do it, that's
Listen,
why.
I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm trying to talk for the audience. And if the audience
Okay.
find moral precepts within Islam that they disagree with, they have to disagree with
If you
Islam.
have an all-knowing
Because
agency-
as you have said,
Yeah, go ahead.
if God says something is moral, then it is moral as a
That's
matter of
what we
fact.
say, yeah.
And so if the people here this evening disagree with the moral precepts of Islam,
that's
they have to disagree
socialization.
with Islam.
Socialization.
Yes, so let's talk about that and let's see if
okay.
it's really
I'll just-
socialization. If
Yeah,
there's something more to it than
yeah.
that.
Okay.
He's been sitting over there quite
You said, if I heard you correctly, anything that God says is moral.
Absolutely.
How do you know what God said?
Well, okay, here, to go back to our argument that I said, that we said that we have revelations of all time, the final revelations of the Quran, it has a falsifiability test. I gave you 4 things: preservation, inimitability, contradictions, and I also taught you about predictions of the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, in order for you to say that the Quran is false, you have to falsify it, like a scientist would have to falsify a theory in order for them to say that that is wrong. Now, if you can't produce any evidence for that, then really you can only remain agnostic on the issue.
How do you
I may
know,
answer, sorry.
How do you know that the words contained in the Quran were the words that were actually supposed to have been spoken to Mohammed by the angel Gabriel, supposing that any
And
of
can
us
we get a
in the
response
modern world can
Do you wanna
actually
answer?
believe anything like that?
Yeah, Abdullah.
Okay, so first and foremost, with regards to morality, it's actually completely irrelevant in this debate concerning when we're discussing explanation of reality. If you don't believe in objective morality, then there's nothing to compare the morality of Islam with.
That's right.
To say that
That's
it is discordant with it.
Yes.
Right. So I think
Yes.
it's a massive red herring, and I think that friend of yours will talk about a few fallacies concerning bringing it up in the first place. You have to first present to us objective
What is the
morality,
yeah.
and then compare it to Islam's morality and say
Yes.
they don't fit. But
Yes,
you can't, and
of
that's
course.
my point. And also the fact that you say, well, if we don't like some morality in the past or some basis for justifying morality in the past, we can change it. Well, that's what's scary. Because in modern, 21st century Europe and on 20th century Europe, need I say more, people thought that morality of people's protections of rights and things were no longer convenient for the nation's security, and then they prejudicially persecute certain minorities because it was no longer beneficial from their estimation. And there's no objective basis to argue against it other than you say, well, I personally don't like or find it distasteful what they did. So that is actually scary that you don't have objective morality, because there's no actual promise of rights that you can actually underwrite. As for the, well, no.
Do you want to let
I mean, well, yes. I mean, there are. I mean, you're either asking a question or you're just having another opening statement. Look, the subjectivity in morality doesn't lie at the level of the act itself. It lies at the level of the motivations. I can say to somebody, like I am a psychological hedonist in the same way that Mill was. I can say I know what people's motivations are, ultimately speaking, and there are objective facts to be known about how to achieve a goal. So it's not a case, moral subjectivism
Mill didn't say this.
moral objectivism,
No, let him have a proper-
moral, I said I'm a psychological utilitarian, utilitarian like John Stuart Mill, not just a utilitarian.
Okay, well, I'll
And
respond to
I
it.
hope the audience can notice the difference in the level of interjection here. Like, I'm trying to really listen to what you have to say, but you've got to let me respond.
Okay, go ahead.
Psychological utilitarianism means that we can know what people's motivations are, and I think we can. There are objective things to be known about how to achieve those goals. If somebody thinks that something's right and I think it's wrong, it's not a case of throw your hands up in the air and say it's everybody's opinion. That's not what moral subjectivism is. That's confusing moral subjectivism with moral relativism. That's not what we're doing.
No, hold on.
And those are not the same thing.
Can we respond?
Go.
All right, so Mill, in chapter 4 of his book on utilitarianism, he actually gave us an exact way of identifying what he called the principle of utility.
Yes.
And through that, he talked about desirability and how when you see that something is desirable for someone, then that is an evidence that it's something which ought to be done.
Okay,
now, hold on, excuse me.
It's not true.
No, hold on, you can check. I've just given you a reference.
Yeah,
you can check.
the title is not called
You're
Proof of
interjecting now.
Yes,
isn't
I
it?
am, because the
So-
title
so
is not...
level of interjection?
The title, I didn't say the audience can notice I'm not interjecting. I said that the audience can notice the disparity in it. Sometimes
so
an
level of
interjection is
interjection.
needed, and the
So,
interjection here is that the
Mohammed,
title...
do you want to finish your
the
point?
go ahead, go ahead.
the title of that chapter, there was a
Yeah, but to
purpose,
continue,
there was a reason why the title of that
respond
chapter
afterwards.
is not the proof of utilitarianism.
It is.
It is not. The
It's
title of that
hold on,
chapter
let me get
is...
the book.
The title of that chapter is the kinds of proofs to which utilitarianism is susceptible.
No, hold on. The title of the chapter is Proof of Utilitarianism.
It's not. You
Get
can
the
check,
book.
You can check it now.
Okay,
It is the types of proof that utilitarianism
Excuse
is
me.
susceptible to.
John Stuart Mill wrote the book himself. You can get the copy from Waterstones now. Everyone in the
challenge
audience
you
can
to do it.
Google it. Yes, it's actually, the title is Proof of Utilitarianism, chapter 4.
That's what people call it. That's not what Mill wrote. Mill,
who calls it that?
the title Mill call no. Mill
What are you
doesn't-
saying?
Mill doesn't call it the proof of utilitarianism.
That's what it's titled.
He avoids it. He does not.
That's the
say
name
that.
of the chapter, my
it's
friend.
It's not the name of the chapter. I
Okay,
can
so should we
promise
get it
you.
up?
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Okay, if anyone's got utilitarianism, we can see.
Okay,
If anybody has a copy of the book, I challenge.
let's leave it on that as a
Yeah.
reference point.
Okay, yes, my friend.
No, no, it's important. It's
Am I
important.
right?
It's important. The
we'll
reason
get
why.
Abdullah,
It's important. The reason
and then-
why.
Either way, look.
Guys,
the
come on, because it's sort of descending into chaos.
Yeah.
We want to get Abdullah, and then we'll get Colin in afterwards.
Okay, so just to continue what I said,
Is he right? It's not proof of... Okay, well, I can see that point. If he's right, I can see
That's
the point.
fine, because I don't care if you're right or wrong about that. The thing that matters is the point that he was making. And the point that he was making is that you can't prove utilitarianism because he's a moral nihilist in that sense. But he said that there are certain proofs to which it's
So if you can't
susceptible.
prove it, why make a case?
So because you can't prove that the point that Mill made with the visible thing.
subjective.
Let me answer the question. The point that Mill made with the visible thing, which you brought up, is that the only evidence we have that something is visible is that it can be seen. That's what he said. Now we can't prove.
Okay,
that
if
this,
you can't prove
we
it, why
can't
make-
prove
why
that this
use it?
water
Okay.
is visible, but we
Okay,
both agree that it is.
one thing.
And we can use the same
One thing.
level
Yeah,
of proof
wait,
to understand moral
Okay,
claims. It's
just-
not a
so
deductive
one
proof.
thing-
It's an inductive.
Why
one
use
thing,
it as an argument?
one thing for someone who said that there are many things that you don't know in the universe and things that you can't presume.
Yes.
For you to claim that you now know people's motivations with the same kind of certainty enough to make it to derive some objective moral system
Yes.
is somewhat of a contradiction there, because everyone's
Yes.
motivations might be unique or different,
Yes.
or unknowable to you anyway. Certainly, we never understand the viewpoint of a psychopath, of
That's
someone
right.
who has the inability to empathize.
Well, the
and-
psychological
or
literature is quite good on that, actually.
yeah, but look, the study, of course, but to make a claim that basically that you can understand everyone's motivations, or there is some kind of unique template of motivations that all human beings subscribe to or can fit into, is really contradicting what you said earlier on, saying that you don't actually know, or you don't make claims to know things which you don't directly observe.
I make claims about morality, and I also didn't say
Brief
that.
response to that from Alex, and
I
then
do-
Colin on the last question, then we're going to open up to audience questions.
I do make claims about morality. That's not a problem. I never said that I didn't. I also didn't say that I don't make
Where
claims
have you
about.
seen morality? Is it in a
I also
microscope,
didn't
telescope?
say.
Illusionary.
I also didn't say that you have to see things to be able to prove them.
Oh, okay. So are they illusionary for you?
I would agree with that statement, and I'm
Right.
glad you agree with
let's leave
that.
it there. We're in agreement. Brilliant. Colin, do you want to do the last
yes,
question?
I'm still waiting for an answer to my question of how you can possibly be sure that what are supposed to be the words spoken by God, or rather by the angel Gabriel
Point to that.
to Mohammed, are actually the words spoken, if indeed they were spoken at all.
Okay, brief response to that, and then we're opening up to the audience.
Okay, so a couple of days ago I presented a lecture on how do we know Islam is true when there's so many different, let's say, conflicting or competing belief systems. In essence, from every aspect, from the Islamic concept of God being a main issue, which is what my presentation was trying to focus on, the Islamic concept of God is almost completely unique to Islam, with the possible exceptions of variations of Judaism and philosophers who've reflected upon the possibilities of what could exist and what create all existence, and they've all come to the same conclusion, just like good old the Greek Xenophon that there must be an ultimate creator who's infinite and he's unlike created things. Xenophon is a famous Greek philosopher who believed that if he rejected polytheism and rejected idols that looked like human beings, saying if a cow had a god, it would make the gods to look like cows. So he wasn't an atheist, he just rejected polytheism. And so we would basically kind of side with that view. But
I asked you a very specific question about what the angel Gabriel is supposed to have said to Mohammed. How can you possibly know, how can anybody possibly know that that was actually what happened? How can you know? Explain.
And if I let me just finish my point, which is Islam is basically, when I encountered it and I took it as a hypothesis for how to explain reality, as one possible hypothesis. After looking at different belief systems, including, or lack thereof, let's say atheistic positions in belief system, naturalism or materialism, communism and such, I basically found contradictions and things that didn't make sense. And it kind of almost had a process of elimination that Islam was the only one left that actually didn't suffer any internal contradictions, both compared to the observable reality as well as within itself. And that's a very tough thing it's a very tall order to actually achieve if you're not explaining everything, quite literally everything. So, and caveat, not the particularities of things like, quarks and bosons, in case you actually say, you're claiming to explain everything. No, but what I noticed is that Islam was the only one left. And then after further investigation, after I thought maybe it could have been a different way, maybe if one particular Islamic doctrine shouldn't exist, or if it was a different way, and I realized that produces contradictions, to the point that I came to the conclusion that Islam was the only possible explanation to explain reality, which is why I was very thrilled to do this debate in the first place. But without going to things like hell's existence and all this other stuff, the main key selling point, to say, of Islam, of the hypothesis of Islam, to explain reality, was its concept of God, which is almost virtually unique to itself, and it's just rationally consistent and coherent.
I didn't ask you about Islam's concept of God. I asked you very specifically about how you can possibly know that the concept of God, whatever it is, that emerges from the Quran can have been dictated to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. I take it, therefore, that you cannot answer that question. Thank you.
Well, it's kind of like the equivalent kind of challenge you're saying. I mean, now we can discuss how do we know the messenger that related the message how do we know from analysis of that it's accurate? But I wanted just to kind of
That's what I'd like to know.
I know.
What I was asking.
I know. And I wanted to do a kind of a different angle to answer that question, which is what got me into Islam in the first place wasn't
answering a different question.
Let me finish, sir. What got me into Islam in the first place wasn't me looking at the claims or trying to go back in a time machine to find out if the Prophet Muhammad existed or the angel Gabriel came to him. I looked at the message itself, and the consistency of the message itself with the universe led me to a conclusion that they both come from the same author, and that's why I became Muslim.
In other words, you can't possibly know. It's just the author.
Okay,
we'll leave it to the audience. Let's see what they have
let's
to
have
say.
some audience questions. The gentleman in the middle there.
Before we ask the question,
Do you want this one, yeah?
Patrick.
Yeah, sure.